Hey guys, I want to talk about the high level of inflation and why I believe China and Russia have their thumbs on the scale in terms of keeping inflation up for the rest of the world, but predominantly on the US. Now, this video is going to be a little bit more analytical and probably a bit deeper, but it was actually inspired by a conversation I had with my colleague. He was asking me for advice about what he should do with his home loan, with his mortgage, whether he should go onto a fixed rate ahead of further rate hikes, or if he should go variable. I actually recommended a blend of both. I told him that in the longer term, we may see interest rates falling back down. Right now, we're seeing interest rates rising up relatively quickly, as well as inflation relatively quickly. But I also said we may see a decline. We may see deflation in the medium to slightly longer term. But as I was going through that thesis, I realized one thing. On the longer term, what led us for 20, 30 years of deflation, the forces that led us to deflation are no longer going to be there. In fact, it's possible to argue that Russia and China are driving forces to why those deflationary forces will not take place. I gave him a bit of an analogy, as I'll give to you. Now, you can think of inflation and deflation as two variables on the dial. And I think thinking of a jet is a good analogy. If you have a jet, an airplane, you have multiple engines, right? If one goes down, you still probably have 3 engines left. So you can still fly. You have 2, it's a bit more difficult, but you're still okay. 3 down, you only have 1 engine, and that's a little bit scary and a little bit shaky, perhaps. Maybe your airplane's a little bit less stable. That's possibly true too. I'm not an aviation expert, but I will say one thing. When we look at the forces of deflation, and I'm going to name the big ones, when we look at the world we're going to head into, perhaps that may not be true. Right. The number one thing for deflation in the last 20, 30 years, you could argue, is technology. Technology in terms of having robots to build cars, computers, internet, that has made the cost of doing business far, far cheaper. And with the advent of something like ChatGPT and other, neuro-linguistic programming and transformer and all these, high-tech AI stuff, chatbots, that's going to continue, and more automation is going to happen. Yes, people are going to lose jobs, but in terms of actually the cost of manufacturing or creating services even, that's going to go down. So tick, we have that engine in terms of keeping prices low, deflation. That's still up. Now, the other 2 or 3, those engines are going to flip the switch. And that's when the conversation gets really interesting. The second factor in terms of as a deflationary force, you'll probably see a number of those countries right there, but probably the number one country that affects deflation would be the advent of China and its manufacturing base. Now, China, I see, is now considered a strategic competitor against the West. Right? And no longer are we happy, especially with COVID-0, to have our manufacturing base and supply chains in China anymore. Now, with that, we are shifting. We can see Apple has been shifting the manufacturing. A quarter of it is now in India, and they're migrating more and more to India and other countries. Vietnam is booming in business because countries, or at least US corporations are transporting their supply chains to Vietnam, right, and other manufacturing bases, which now has lower cost of labor. However, the cost of that transition is going to last for years to decades to transfer all that knowledge and infrastructure from a very, very well-built set of manufacturing infrastructure in China. The other thing about China is that they probably can't help it, but they've got a declining population, right? They've reported their first year of declining population this year. Now, with that, we can probably say quite safely that it's going to be a start of a new trend. Now, this is probably arguably the most intense level of depopulation, but a decline in population, and especially a decline in working population that the world has ever seen. We have hundreds of millions of Chinese citizens of working age, maybe from 20 to 40, 50. Now, that population is going to shrink dramatically because we had the one-child policy back in the 70s, and that's taking full effect, right? And that was continuing through, the 80s and the 90s and so on and so forth. Now, that decline from the drop-off in birth rates from the 70s, now we're hitting the 40, 50 year mark right now. And we're seeing the beginning of that trend. That trend has actually, that birth rate has been dropping through the 80s, 90s, and so on and so forth. So if this is the first year of declining population, we're going to have decades of declining population in China. So a manufacturing base of hundreds of millions could probably shrink by 20, 30, 40, 50%. It's going to be the fastest decline in human history because no other country has restricted birth rates that intensely, that acutely for decades. So what does that mean? Well, when you have hundreds of millions of workers that can produce things, manufacture things, and that population, that working population shrinks in no time flat, you're going to have less people to employ. You can have a smaller labor force. And globalization, the reason why it kept prices down was because there was a lower, because there was a cheap pool of labor that was available. Now that labor is less available. There's less supply of cheap labor. Because of less supply, as you know, supply and demand dynamics means the prices go up for that labor. It means also the prices of manufactured goods go up. Now, this is the last piece in terms of what shapes inflation or deflation. And I believe this one may violate even the benefits of accelerating technology, and that is energy. At this point in time, when we look at who really pulls the strings, Russia is pulling the strings with energy far more than we care to admit. Right? They have such a massive reserve of energy in terms of natural gas and petrol, right? But not only that, and they have restricted, and we've actually forced them to restrict it through sanctions, their output in energy, right? And energy feeds through every part of our economy to grow food, to manufacturing, right? Now, this is why we see with the high cost of energy, we're seeing shortages in the UK, right? Because growing food and making fertilizer uses natural gas, a lot of energy to make food. We're seeing food shortages again in the UK, and I'm sure in other places will follow, right? We're seeing Germany, and we'll probably see it here, quickly referring Germany, GDP is not doing well. It's down 0.4, which is basically recession levels, and we're going to head into recession levels in the last quarter, yet their inflation levels are 8.7 inflation. Very high inflation, yet the GDP is going backward as of this quarter. Why? Because they're a manufacturing hub and they use a lot of energy to manufacture. Now, if energy prices are going through the roof because of this conflict with the Ukraine and Russia, then they're going to be hit really hard. And if you're into buying German cars or whatever it is, the prices of that are going up. And it's going to be harder to find that sort of stuff. So inevitably, yes, we want to slow the economy down by raising interest rates. But regardless of that, prices are still probably going to go up. So when we look at it through the lens of what China and Russia can do, it's highly inflationary. Like if you think that Mr. Let me get Jay Powell. If you think this gentleman here is able to crush inflation, right? the guy in control of the central bank is able to crush inflation just by raising interest rates and slowing demand, perhaps think again, because all Russia or China needs to do is to restrict sort of the access of us to energy or different raw materials. And it's not just Russia or China, but let me explain in terms of how they can build their influence. So Russia has developed, and China has developed, a very close relationship with Iran, who is a major oil producer. Russia is now has a more influential place in OPEC Plus. They actually make the calls in terms of, they actually influence the decision of OPEC to cut oil production, which keeps oil prices up. And they have a very powerful say, and they can withdraw supply from the market, and it really does affect the price. So at any moment in time, they can really cut supply and push our prices up for energy as well, which leads to everything else in the economy. We produce less. Our economy is going slow, is slowing, but yet the prices go up. They have the ability to do that. And as they do that, right, as we have high inflation, we have no choice but to raise interest rates. Raising interest rates on $31 trillion of debt in the US accounts, right, means that the US is going to struggle to pay their debts. It pushes the US closer and closer to, you could say, bankruptcy. It's not going to happen, but it's going to put a lot of financial pressure on the US government. So this is a financial war that is able to be played out against Russia. And to put insult or put salt in the wounds, over the last year that Russia has experienced sanctions, their economy grew over the last 12 months, right? Which goes to show that they can play this game even if they experience sanctions. And they hold the cards, a lot of it, with their energy play and the influence with other energy players. China itself has the ability to hold influence over its over production, over manufacturing, and they can squeeze the supply and ramp up the prices, which puts a lot of pressure on the West. Now, there are other trends also in terms of redeploying supply chains. Supply chains are going to Mexico and other places around China. It's a longer term trend that's going to work against them. But these two trends, as well as so these two trends of energy and a competition between scarce resources, as well as the migration of supply chains away from China, that is a heavy price to pay for the West and across the world. So what's my take on it? I think that with high interest rates, we will likely see some sort of heavy recession and deflation over the next couple of months. Over the longer term, I'm not so sure. I think you've got one engine that's the technology engine that's going to run strong, but the other two, in terms of scarce resources and energy supplies, and scarce labor in the global in the global supply chain, that's going to keep the prices really high. So that's my take in terms of how Russia and China actually can put their thumb on our economics. And that's what I'm weighing in terms of my next investment move. It's very difficult to find a stock or property that can beat that high level of interest and beat inflation at the moment. It's quite difficult because at any moment we could have a recession. A very difficult investing environment. I'm struggling, to be fair. I'm looking to buy more, invest more, but it's a hard decision-making period. Anyway, this is my update for today, for this coming period, and I hope you enjoyed that. What do you think? Do you think there's going to be inflation, or do you think we're going to head into recession, have deflation, and after that, we're going to be back on a typical, low inflation and low interest rate regime? What do you think? Do you think we're going to go back to the last 10, 20 years? Or Are we going to be seeing higher and higher levels of inflation in the next 10, 20 years? I still haven't mentioned one thing, the cost of transition to green energy, right? That means we're going to have less energy, more or less, unless we're cutting out the most dense forms of energy in terms of coal, petrol, or gas, natural gas. And we're moving towards less intense energy that, such as wind and solar, maybe uranium, but uranium nuclear reactors take a long time to build. That's going to be a headwind, higher cost of energy too. So anyway, I might have answered the question. But what do you guys think going forward? How is it going to play out in the next 10, 20 years? How are you going to invest? Let me know in the comments down below. Like if you liked it. Subscribe if you haven't yet. I appreciate that. I'll see you guys in the next ones. Thank you then. Bye.